I'm Cheryl Atkinson. Welcome to Full Measure. Today, new information about what may be the most confounding mystery surrounding the Benghazi controversy. Why no outside U.S. military help came to the rescue as terrorists battered two compounds and the Americans inside for nearly 8 hours. 4 Americans were killed, Ambassador Chris Stevens and diplomat Sean Smith, along with former Navy SEALs Glenn Doherty and Ty Woods. In recent days, the House Benghazi Committee heard from key figures in closed-door testimony. They include former CIA Director David Petraeus and former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta. And later this week, they'll hear from a third official that few have probably heard of. Jeremy Bash, former Defense Department Chief of Staff, whose email happens to be central to our report today. It's an email he sent from the military to the State Department the night of the Benghazi attacks, one that's been kept from public view for 3 years and lends evidence to allegations of a rescue interrupted.
We need immediate assistance. We are overrun. If you do not get here soon, we are all going to die.
The film 13 Hours, The Secret Soldiers of Benghazi opens later this week.
None of you have to go. We are the only help they have.
It's the harrowing account of 6 CIA team members in an annex about a mile from the Benghazi compound when it fell under attack. They claim when they tried to go to the rescue, their boss delayed them.
You're not the first responders. You're the last resort. You will wait.
Now, an email hidden from public view for 3 years reveals another rescue attempt was apparently interrupted. The military offered to deploy special forces to Benghazi during the assault, long before the attackers killed CIA contractors and former Navy SEALs Glenn Doherty and Ty Woods. 3.5 hours into the 8-hour-long siege, the military's Chief of Staff, Jeremy Bash, emails top State Department officials. We have identified the forces that could move to Benghazi. They are spinning up as we speak. They include a Special Operations Forces element that was in Croatia.
They're spun up as we speak means he's made contact with them. They've confirmed that they've been given that order, and they're making progress toward going to that location.
Retired Army Green Beret Colonel Andrew Wood commanded a Special Forces anti-terrorism team protecting Ambassador Chris Stevens and other diplomats in Libya.
I feel duty-bound to come forward.
In 2012, Wood told Congress his team was removed from Libya by the Obama administration a month before the attacks, despite warnings of terrorist violence to come. For the first time, Wood speaking out with a startling claim that those special forces offered in the military email were on their way to Benghazi, but were turned back.
Those individuals, I know, loaded aircraft and got on their way to Benghazi to respond to that incident. They were not allowed to cross the border, as per protocol, until they get approval from the Commander-in-Chief. That authority has got to come from him, otherwise they're not allowed to go further into the country. I have a high degree of confidence that happened based on information that I've heard from individuals that were there. Those forces were put into motion. They simply were not allowed to go further.
The White House has refused to detail the involvement of President Obama, the commander-in-chief, while Americans were under attack on foreign soil. Following a short briefing at the beginning of the assault, he virtually disappears from the public narrative. The White House declined to comment for this report, but has long denied any assets were available or ready and said everything possible was done. Yet the email indicates special forces were ready and high-ranking Obama administration officials or principals were to weigh in. Assuming principals agree to deploy these elements, we will ask state to secure the approval from host nation, the military tells the State Department. Please advise how you wish to convey that approval to us. Inexplicably, nobody did seek Libya's approval for the U.S. forces to fly in to help. The availability of special forces is news to Greg Hicks, the top U.S. diplomat in Tripoli during the assault. In 2013, Hicks testified he was repeatedly told there was no military help available.
I asked the defense attaché who'd been talking with AFRICOM and with the Joint Staff, is anything coming? Will they be sending us any help? Is there something out there?
Responding to the newly public email, Hicks tells Full Measure, an aggressive interpretation of the military options presented would have tasked me with obtaining flight and landing clearances from the Libyan government. I have no doubt they would have been granted.
Significance of this memo, what would you say?
It's incredibly significant, and you would understand why the administration wouldn't want people to see that those elements within the government that were tasked with the protection of, lives and property actually started the process and were stopped.
Gary Bernsen is a former CIA senior operations officer and chief of station. He commanded counterterrorism missions and led the response team after Islamic extremists bombed U.S. embassies in East Africa in 1998. Like Wood, Bernsen says quick reaction military teams are tasked to handle emergencies exactly like Benghazi and automatically spin up unless and until they're stopped.
You proceed because if there's an emergency and Americans are at risk, Americans have died or are under the threat of death or a threat of kidnapping or any kind of violence, we're moving.
A military source familiar with some of the night's events also confirms military options were provided. There were both conventional and special forces in theater and assigned to Africa Command offered up by General Carter Ham on a video teleconference. Based on what I know, the forces they were talking about could have gotten there pretty quickly.
Only political instructions from above would have stopped them. There is, no one is going to wait. That is my experience of, having done this for almost 25 years, having led the teams myself. You're proceeding, you're going.
When we come back, what Obama officials have said about the military response that night, and we ask why a rescue would have been interrupted.
Was any DOD asset ever deployed to help these people before the end of the attack?
We continue with questions over whether Benghazi involved a rescue interrupted and a newly revealed email showing the U.S. military offered up a special forces team to deploy to Benghazi long before the last two Americans were murdered. But the Obama administration never sought approval for their planes to fly into Libya.
State's under attack. Let's go, man. State's under attack.
The upcoming film, 13 Hours, The Secret Soldiers of Benghazi, recounts the story of CIA agents who say they were prevented from going to the immediate rescue of the Americans under attack a mile away, and no outside military came to help. But now an internal government email shows U.S. Special Forces not far away had spun up during the attack, and sources say they were headed to Benghazi, but were stopped. The new details may help explain why Congress had so much trouble getting direct answers from Obama officials who insisted a rescue attempt was impossible. When questioned in 2013, General Martin Dempsey, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Secretary Leon Panetta of the Department of Defense, or DOD, gave no hint that Special Forces had actually spun up.
Was any DOD asset ever deployed to help these people before the end of the attack?
Would you rephrase?
Was any DOD asset, aircraft or individual soldier, ever put in motion to help these people before the attack was over?
If I could, as soon as we knew there was an attack, the National Mission Force and the FAST teams began.
My question is, did anybody leave any base anywhere to go to the aid of the people under attack in Benghazi, Libya, before the attack ended?
No, because the attack ended before they could get off the ground.
Multiple officials said the same thing.
There simply wasn't enough time at that point to bring U.S. military forces.
Their assets were too far away to make much difference in any timely fashion.
There simply was not enough time for U.S. military forces to have made a difference.
Adding to the claims of a rescue interrupted, the leader of a foreign emergency support team in the U.S. earlier testified his squad too was stopped from responding, and a small U.S. military team in Tripoli was ordered not to board a plane for Benghazi during the attacks. Wood says it all implies a decision at the highest level. Otherwise, he believes the military would have gotten in position to respond 5 hours before the Benghazi attacks, when the U.S. faced a related crisis. Islamic extremists overran the American embassy in Cairo, Egypt.
Their compound had been breached, and there were people now inside their buildings under protection of Marine guards waiting for someone to bust into the rooms. To me, that would signal that somebody should be getting those reaction forces ready to stand by and perhaps move. And then 5 hours later, when things occurred in Benghazi, and that again, the alarm bell went off, and there was no apparent response, that's a pretty tough one to explain. With events transpiring in Cairo, at the embassy in Cairo, I think the decision not to react may have been made very early on in the day when those events were transpiring, so that by the time Benghazi happened, it wasn't going to happen because that decision was made early on.
If so, why isn't clear. But the attacks came 8 weeks before the 2012 election. President Obama had campaigned on the idea that he'd sent terrorists running.
Al-Qaeda's on the path to defeat, and Osama bin Laden is dead.
Critics say deploying the military to terrorist attacks could have been viewed as more harmful to the campaign than the incorrect explanation the administration gave that protesters attacked after being whipped up by an anti-Islamic YouTube video.
No, I understand, Father.
A Special Forces soldier for 24 years, Wood says his team and U.S. diplomats in Libya were briefed that if they ever got into trouble, those Special Forces in Europe were tasked with coming to the rescue.
They're kept in a high state of readiness just for that purpose. So they're willing and able and ready to jump on. They're like the fire department in any town, in any city in the United States.
To illustrate how close the U.S. Special Forces in Croatia were, a commercial flight taking off at the start of the Benghazi attacks with an hour-and-a-half layover in Turkey could still have arrived in Libya before Woods and Doherty were killed. But the Special Forces offered up by the military ended up at the U.S. naval base at Sigonella, Italy, instead of Benghazi. And in a delay that remains unexplained, it took 17 hours from the time the military said they'd spun up for them to make that hour-and-a-half flight from Croatia to Italy, far too late to help.
I operated there under the belief that those reaction forces would be there for us if we got into some kind of trouble like what happened.
Two groups of testimony given under oath by government officials were there were no forces that could have responded quickly, and that even if they had scrambled more people, they couldn't have gotten there in time to make a difference.
I don't believe either of those reflect the truth of what occurred on the ground there. They had forces moving. They could have intervened. They should have intervened. And had they, we likely would have been in a position to save the second two men who bravely sacrificed their lives.
The State Department has said the notion that it did not do everything possible to protect our people that night is as offensive as it is wrong. There's one piece of evidence that could help in the debate: the military after-action reports dissecting the military response, but the Pentagon has refused congressional and media requests to see them.